Good evening. We start tonight's program by talking about defense spending. Nothing very unusual about that. People do that a lot these days, but the way we approach the subject is very unusual because we present the views of a man who challenges assumptions. That's an exciting prospect because it forces us to examine our own ideas, ideas that often make us feel secure. Feeling secure in a world of superpower confrontation in the age of nuclear missiles is hard to do. And many of us cling to ideas of defense that are familiar and comforting. Not the man you're about to hear. He is Noam Chomsky, one of the world's leading authorities on linguistics. He teaches at MIT, and a prolific and provocative analyst of world affairs. I talked with him when he came here this winter to speak at the University of Minnesota. Now, Chomsky has an idea about the nature of the Cold War and how it has us hurtling toward nuclear disaster. It is an idea we never hear included in reporting or interpretation of world events by our mainstream news media. Chomsky considers them a major part of the problem. Here's how he traces the roots of the Cold War. During World War II, the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations, that is the big business-oriented group that involves itself in national policy making, together they planned the shape of the turf they wanted to control economically after the war. Here's what that turf included: the Western Hemisphere, the Far East, and the former British Empire at the least. The question was, how about the Soviet Union and the turf it collected during the war? Of course, the Soviets had an answer for that. Yet. Chomsky says that even though all this is documented, no one has ever been willing to talk about it, not even scholars. That is part of the cost, he says, of our living according to values imposed by the United States stance in the Cold War confrontation.
Well, the Cold War then continued, and I think it continued because, in fact, it's very functional for the two superpowers. And if you look at the incidents of the Cold War, you can see exactly how it works. I mean, when we want to invade some country or subvert its government, let's say overthrow the government of Guatemala in 1954, the government can't come to the American people and say, look, there's a democratic government in Guatemala which is carrying out New Deal measures and trying to improve the lot of poor peasants and giving them, unused land that's owned by the United Fruit Company, and therefore we have to overthrow it and put in a gang of monsters who are going to destroy the unions and carry out genocide. You can't say that. So what we say, that's in fact roughly what was happening. What we have to say is, well, we have to defend ourselves from a Russian attack. And I say Guatemala is an outpost of international communism, and the communists are brutal as they are, and so on. And if we don't stop them there, they're going to be in New York before you know it. And that's sufficient to frighten the population, and then we can overthrow the government of Guatemala. And they can count on the New York Times and the media to give that story, which they did. The press loyally reported the government propaganda story for many years. In fact, even today, they've barely unearthed the truth about it. But given that they can count on, and that's a typical Cold War incident. Same with the Russians. I mean, when the Russians invaded Hungary 2 years later, they didn't tell their population, look, there's a socialist revolution going on in Hungary, and there are workers' councils taking over industry, therefore we have to move in and destroy it. Can't say that. So what they said is, well, Hungary's being taken over by fascists who are working for the CIA, and pretty soon they're going to be in Moscow, so we have to stop it. And the population believed it. Now, and of course the press reported it, because in the Soviet Union they do it by order of the state. That's a different system than ours. Here they do it by moral cowardice and class interest. There they do it by threat of state violence. But the effects are very similar, and that's the way the Cold War has been going. You pick any incident and you'll find out this is exactly the way it worked.
On one level, you talk about the military threat. What about the threat that corporate America says it sees, creeping socialism? What's the story on socialism in the Soviet Union and on America's perceptions of it and Russian perceptions of it?
That's a very interesting example of the way propaganda works. In fact, this is one of the greatest achievements of 20th century propaganda, I think, has been to identify the Soviet Union with socialism. Now, in fact, there are two major propaganda systems in the world, ours, which is the dominant one, and the Soviet one, which is the secondary one. And when they agree on something, it's very hard for anybody to break out of that. And they agree on this. I mean, the American propaganda system insists that what's happening, we call it the socialist world. The reason we do it is to try to defame socialism by identifying it with the Russian dungeon. Now, the Russians also call their system socialist, and the reason they do it is to try to pick up the credit of socialism to overcome the sort of tarnished facts about their own, their own dungeon. So for different reasons, both propaganda systems want to identify the Russians with socialism. In fact, The Soviet system, and this goes back to 1917, is diametrically opposed to socialism. I mean, the minimal property that any socialist system was supposed to have was control by producers over production. That's the essence of socialism. That means that workers take control of production, decide how it's done, determine the conditions of their work. In fact, the whole meaning of socialism was to extend the concept of democratic control to the workplace. I mean, the first thing that Lenin and Trotsky did after the coup, which we call the Bolshevik Revolution, it was really just a coup, first thing they did was to destroy all the workers' councils, to destroy the Soviets, to destroy the factory councils, and to institute what they called militarization of labor. That is, elimination of any degree of worker participation in production. And that was literally the first act of the revolution, so-called revolution, coup, actually. It was really a counter-revolutionary coup, the Bolshevik Revolution. But of course, again, see, they call it a revolution, we call it a revolution for opposite reasons, because we want to defame the concept of popular worker revolution, and they want to appeal, they want to exploit the prestige associated with revolutionary socialism. But the whole thing's just a fraud, fraud from beginning to end. And both sides can persist in it. When there has been any authentic socialist development anywhere, we've all opposed it. Every single case. I mean, for example, there was a popular socialist revolution in Spain in 1936. The Russians and the Americans and the British and, in fact, the Nazis combined to destroy it.
Okay, both sides are in business to survive and grow. Why doesn't the United States cut a deal with the Soviet Union?
Well, we actually have a deal. I mean, the Cold War is a kind of a deal. It's kind of a tacit agreement.
Yeah, but there are nuclear weapons.
Yeah, but we see that we need too. And both sides need it for their own reasons. I mean, I don't want to make it sound as if they're sort of sitting down and planning this. It just, it continues because it satisfies interests. Now, it's also dangerous. They're in conflict. And at the same time, while they're in opposition, they're also cooperating. The point is that, as I said, the Cold War system, this idea that there's this great enemy, the great Satan, which is, the evil empire, which both sides exploit, that's the way they terrorize and control their own populations. And nuclear weapons, incidentally, are, in part at least, a method of controlling your own population. I mean, every state wants nuclear weapons, and one of the reasons is that the mere possession of nuclear weapons extends and increases the power of the state over its own population. If you have nuclear weapons, you have to have a secrecy system. You have to have police. You have to have authority which is impenetrable. That's just what governments want. They don't want to be perceived. So, for example, take the Reagan administration, which is by no means conservative. I mean, it's sort of proto-fascist in a way. And one of the things the Reagan administration has tried to do is to prevent. See, it's supposed to be their pretense is that they want to break down big government. The actuality is exactly the opposite. One of the things they've tried to do is to protect government from scrutiny.
Let me interrupt you for a second. There are probably thousands of people listening to you right now who just heard you say proto-fascist, and they think that this is the freest country in the world. What do you say to people who criticize you for criticizing the freest country in the world?
I'm talking about the administration. I'm talking about the instincts of the administration. What they want to do is prevent this from being the freest country in the world. It is, in fact, the freest country in the world. It's the country in the world that has the most open acts, in which the government is least able to protect itself from scrutiny and is least able to exercise violence over the population. Among the countries in the world, at least the major, I don't know, Luxembourg maybe, but among the major countries in the world, this is the freest in this sense. But the instincts of the Reagan administration and their efforts are to try to overcome that, what they regard as a defect in the American system, namely that it's a free and open society. So in fact, if you look at the policies of the Reagan administration, what are they after all? Their major social policy is to create a powerful state. They're in fact increasing the role of the state in the economy. Just the opposite of what they're pretending to do. That's what the military system is about. The big military production has nothing to do with defense of the United States. In fact, you can see that. Their pretended justification was what they called a window of vulnerability. But the window of vulnerability was a fraud, and they now, in fact, concede that it was a fraud. The Scowcroft Commission conceded that it was a fraud, but they continue. And the reason has to do with something totally different. That's the way in which the state intervenes in the economy. The state intervenes in the economy by creating a huge government market, state market, for high technology production called armaments. And that's the way you give a subsidy to the advanced sectors of the industrial economy.
Are weapons the only commodity that you can make this work on?
See, the reason is that if the government were to become involved in useful production for the market, say automobile production or subways or something, if it was to do that, it would begin to interfere with the prerogatives of big business. See, as soon as the state begins to interfere in the market system, it's constraining the operations of business. Now, this is a business-run government, and policy has to be designed so it doesn't interfere with the rights and prerogatives and power of big business. In fact, policy has to be designed so it supports them. The government is basically a support system for big business. Now, the point is that, and you see, that's why the government is going to always be involved in waste production. It's going to be involved in the production of high-technology waste. And furthermore, it has to be rapidly obsolescing high-technology waste, because you got to keep replacing it. And furthermore, the taxpayer's got to pay for it, which means the taxpayer has to have a reason for paying high-technology industry to produce waste. Now, that's a tricky set of constraints. Very hard to convince people. You can't come to people and say, look, you guys have to give your little bit of money that you have as a gift to the rich and powerful so that they can produce waste to be thrown away. You can't say that. When the Reagan administration came in early 1981, you could predict at once, well, I mean, I don't say this in retrospect, I was writing at the time, that they are going to seek confrontation everywhere. And the reason they're going to seek confrontation everywhere is for the same reason the Kennedy administration did, because of their domestic program. Their domestic program is one of militarization of the economy, an increase of state power, an increase of state repressiveness. The only way to achieve those domestic programs is with an external threat. And therefore they're going to seek an external threat everywhere. They're going to seek confrontation everywhere. And that's exactly what they've been doing.
Before we meet our invited guests, I'd like to get some response from the audience. You ever heard anything like that?
Well, I think Noam Chomsky is extremely articulate. I myself am most interested in how much of our defense spending really goes to defense of the United States as opposed to application of control around the world, and he sort of alluded to that, but didn't help me. I was hoping some of your guests will do that.
How about you?
Well, I was not really amused by Noam Chomsky's position, even though I don't have any class interest in the defense industry. I have no financial interest. And I think really his thesis falls of its own weight. For example, his argument of an increased governmental role of the state in the Reagan administration, which he labeled proto-fascist, a totally fantastic and extreme claim, falls of its own weight. We've reduced revenue sharing, we've reduced education funds, we've reduced domestic pork barrel spending, and, you know, his claims are just totally counterfactual.
Okay, who wants to respond? Another response to what you just heard? Yeah.
At the same time, we increase government spending through the military. That's exactly what he's talking about. You take it away from people in the form of education and welfare spending, and then you give it to the corporations.
Someone else? Yes.
Well, I'm Wilfred Weber, and I think some of the things that he said there about high research at 3M is not waste. High research at 3M is what built 3M. And I think that now that I've had 47 years of service there, that I should help keep our production going, not put them out of work.
Okay. Now let me...